I picked up this book recently, kind of a memoir / how-to book, and there was a line in it that stood out to me. Policing is one of the few professions in the United States that has the power to take a citizen's freedom or life, so the standards for officer conduct must be high and non-negotiable. I totally agree with that statement, which surprised me because the author of the book is Terry Ziegler, former chief of the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, and former partner to Detective Roger Golubski. If anyone should have known what Golubski was allegedly doing, if anyone should have stopped it, it's Terry Ziegler. The book is a strange read. Knowing what I know about the KCKPD, it's like some weird funhouse mirror version of the department, a place full of popcorn machines and accountability, and a boss focused on morale. The subtitle of the book is Leadership Lessons from Law Enforcement. And there's advice. Things like, when employees have the courage to bring issues to the attention of supervisors, managers, and leaders, they need to be thanked for doing so. And a warning that sometimes leadership change is about, quote, getting rid of the negative past. We heard similar things in the months leading up to December, when Golubski was finally supposed to go on trial. Kansas City officials and others often talked about accountability, asserting their adherence to a standard that ensured consequences for misbehavior. But in Kansas City, nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this is Corruption Uncovered, a podcast from Roc Nation and its philanthropic injustice division, Team Roc. Ziegler joined the department in 1990 and served with the KCKPD for 29 years, 4 of them as chief. During those years, Detective Roger Golubski was accused of sexually assaulting women and girls, framing their sons for murder, and sex trafficking, among other crimes. And, as you'll hear in this episode, when people inside and outside of the department raised concerns, they didn't get a thank you.
I called to try to complain and went to victim services first to complain because I thought they would be very interested in knowing what had happened. And I reported it. They said, we'll get back with you in a week or so. A week passed, 2 weeks passed, 3 weeks passed, and finally I had to call them back. And they said, oh yeah, we've talked about that, but there's nothing we can do. That's Golubski. That's the way he operates.
They sort of said, we already know this is who he is.
Yeah.
That voice you hear is Rick Behrens.
I'm pastor at Grandview Park Presbyterian Church in Kansas City, Kansas.
And are you from Kansas City, Kansas originally?
I am, yeah. Born and raised here.
Back in the late 1990s, he was a chaplain with the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. It's
a volunteer situation, and there's a corps of chaplains who pass around a pager and pass around it used to be an old Crown Vic police car that they painted chaplain on the side of.
Rick's father died when he was young, and Rick went to live with his grandparents. His uncle was also living there and working as an officer with the KCKPD. His stories gave Rick a sense of how the department functioned.
He had these 2 Doberman pinschers out back in a pen. I didn't know what he used those dogs for, but I heard all kinds of things about him, not only from other people, but from his own mouth about how he operated. He would pull people over just driving while black, and told me, yeah, I made some great arrests that way.
Rick learned early on what has been clear for decades. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department was accountable to no one. As far back as the 1970s, there were reports of KCKPD officers flouting the law. One article from 1978 mentions how an officer, quote, used his patrol car as a battering ram to break down the door of a clothing store to burglarize the business. And there are others, too. The officer selling drugs, the officer smuggling a handgun into jail for an inmate, the officer caught in a gambling raid. The chief at the time was exasperated that, quote, minor things got blown out of proportion. You have to expect a few bad apples in a department of this size, he said, but hopefully we've gotten rid of some of them. As it turns out, Roger Golubski was named in that article too, nearly 50 years ago. That was the year that Golubski, then about 25 years old, beat a man in jail who later died at the hospital, an incident that drew the attention of the FBI, who said they were investigating the case for, quote, possible civil rights violations. But if an investigation happened, it was never made public. Meanwhile, Golubski was later cleared of wrongdoing. Over the years, there were hints of the wrongdoing that seemed baked into the department. In the 70s, the 10 police officers accused of soliciting the same sex worker. Concern about the number of civilians killed by police in the early 80s, and the officers who began wearing shirts that said, "Shoot first, ask questions later." The police officers who in the 90s conspired with drug dealers, even tipping them off to investigations by the federal government. Terry Ziegler's book also provides some insight into the department culture. Ziegler writes that until the mid-90s, quote, there used to be a stack of porn magazines readily accessible at all patrol stations. It wasn't uncommon for officers to look through the magazines prior to roll call, or if they took their lunch break in the patrol station. He also says that commanders and detectives were allowed to have a cocktail or beer with their lunch. Even the little snippets of information that we have convey a culture of impunity in Kansas City, and very little effort to eradicate it. In fact, it was so bad that in the early 1990s, the FBI took a look at the department. In an internal memo, they noted the corruption and misconduct that ran rampant. The investigation to date has uncovered numerous civil rights violations being committed by KCKPD officers on a routine basis, the FBI found. The KCKPD does not investigate civil rights allegations against its officers any more than it investigates allegations of drug dealing or robberies committed by officers. The document mentions numerous instances of people receiving severe beatings from police, but adds that they do not make complaints because, quote, they know it will not do any good and nothing will come of it. It goes on to say that any formal complaints are, quote, only the tip of the iceberg. They found that the department, quote, ignores the extensive crack cocaine problem in Kansas City, Kansas, in part because of corruption within the police department. The FBI detailed incident after incident, the time a group of, quote, young people were attacked by officers who called them the N-word, kicked them in the ribs, and hit them in the head with a gun. The time officers took a handcuffed man to an undisclosed location and threatened to hang him. The memo concludes that the situation within the KCKPD has existed for decades. The situation did not develop overnight, and it will not be solved overnight. The FBI has never convicted any KCKPD officer of any crime. Until this office does convict several police officers, and hopefully gain the cooperation of some of these police officers, the situation in Kansas City, Kansas will only deteriorate. But no one was convicted. No one was even charged. And the situation, as the FBI called it, continued. The allegations against Roger Golubski, which include aggravated sexual abuse and kidnapping, date from between the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s. So when Rick Behrens became a chaplain with the KCKPD in the 90s, he didn't know the depths of the problems, but he did know that the department had issues.
I guess when I started on the chaplain corps, my hope or my belief was that a lot of that had been cleaned up. But in the course of my 6 years there, I saw that that probably wasn't the case.
Rick would get paged when the police thought a situation might need a chaplain. Mostly shootings and death notifications, he said.
As I got started doing the work and would go out on calls, I did see things that troubled me. I saw detectives, lying to family members about victims. There was one instance where, and I know that cops are free to do this all they want, to lie to people, and they do it, and it's legal, but it's not moral. I was on this one call on a drive-by shooting. A young person, I think like a 10-year-old boy, had been shot through the walls of a house on a drive-by shooting. And afterwards, the house was, roped off, taped off. And the family members were sitting on the steps of the house next door. And the detective came to them and wanted to find out about another son in the family and his connection to gangs, if he knew any, if he was going to expose any names. And the family said, yeah, we'll talk to you about that, but we want to see our child. Let us into the house. And, I knew they weren't going to let him into the house. And the cop said, okay, I will. Just give me some more information. Tell me more information about these kids. And that was a telling moment for me, because I knew that the welfare of this family wasn't what he was interested in. And it was very disturbing. And those kinds of things kept happening until I got to the point where I actually had this incident with Golubski.
So tell me when you first start hearing stories about Roger Golubski, or you get a sense of who he is.
Yeah, I didn't really hear anything about him until I ended up in a room with him on a death notification, and I didn't even know who he was at that point. It was only afterwards. So I got a page for a death notification in the northeast section of KCK, and it took me a little longer to get there. It was prior to at least me using any kind of navigation services, and it was in a neighborhood that I hadn't been in before. And I got there, and they were already inside doing notification. What was strange was that I found out later it was Golubski who was heading the thing up, and there were like 2 victim services people there with him. And I only found out later, really, that this was a young man who had been on probation, who apparently, according to reports, ran from police, and they apprehended him and put him in the car, and he died in their custody in the car. So I didn't find that out until really after all this, because I just get called to go do the notification. And so I knocked on the door. They were already in there. Golubski was on one side of the room. The family, which included the mom, was sitting on a couch. The sister and her husband were standing in the doorway to the kitchen. I can still see it pretty clearly in my mind's eye. And the 2 victim services people were kind of in between against the far wall. I came in and was facing this array of people. And Golubski from one side of the room says, we're sorry for your loss. And the mother, who's sitting on the couch, hands in her lap, her head down in a complete posture of dejection and submission even, but her voice did not submit. Her voice said, "You killed my son." And Golubski then came across the room to her and stood over her, and she said, "You killed my son. The system killed my son." And he just shouted at her, "Lady, you are the system." And then he said some other things. At that point, my mind is reeling. What am I going to do? How am I going to be any kind of a help in this situation? And pretty much right after that, he just kind of snapped his fingers. I don't think he really snapped his fingers, but he looked at the victim services people, who said absolutely nothing, and said, "Let's go," and started to walk toward the door with the 2 victim services people, and then turned and saw that I was still standing there and said, "Come on, let's go." And I said, I'm not going with you. I'm staying here. So that's when I stayed with the family for about an hour or so and found out the rest of the story about what had happened to their son and the questions that they had. And then the next day, I called to try to complain and went to victim services first to complain, because I thought they would be very interested in knowing what had happened. And I reported it. They said, "We'll get back with you in a week or so." A week passed, 2 weeks passed, 3 weeks passed, and finally I had to call them back. And they said, "Oh yeah, we've talked about that, but there's nothing we can do. That's Golubski. That's the way he operates."
Okay, so you reported him, and then you don't get any follow-up, and then they sort of say, "Well, there's nothing we can do. This is Golubski." Yeah. And what happens after that?
Nothing. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this was just another cop who's poorly trained and who doesn't know how to deal with people. And I didn't know anything about what he had been doing otherwise. Didn't have any knowledge of any of that. And so, I just sort of dropped it. It was the event that finalized my desire to not be a chaplain anymore.
Rick stepped away from the force, but kept his eye on the department and on Golubski. His church became a member of More Squared, a faith-based community group in KCK. So obviously, so much of this, the KCKPD story has focused on Golubski. Did he stick out as the absolute worst? Were there others like that?
Yeah, I think clearly he sticks out as the worst, but I know that we worked hard because all the people who covered for him were still around 10, 15 years after, and some are still there, I'm sure. But when I started working with More Squared, Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity, that's when I began to hear a lot more things because the people in the community trusted More Squared to listen and to organize around what they were naming. So we called for his former partner who had become chief, Terry Ziegler. We called for him to be fired. Mm-hmm. We had a big rally, called for him to be fired because it's clear that he was with him on a bunch of calls and around him when all these things were going on. He claimed no knowledge of it whatsoever. But we pushed for him to be fired. It might have been a couple weeks or a month later that he submitted his resignation and was gone in a couple more months after that.
In 2022, Rick was named to something called the Law Enforcement Advisory Board.
The Law Enforcement Advisory Board came into being, I believe it was 2005, 2006, as a result of a DOJ investigation into an incident that happened in the Turner neighborhood in Kansas City, Kansas, which is had been and was at the time a predominantly white neighborhood on the southern side of the city with its own school district. It was one of those neighborhoods that you could say developed because of white flight. And there was a party at a house. The party was mostly African Americans, and the neighbors called the police about this party being out of hand. And the police arrived along with sheriff's deputies, two groups together, corralled people, used excessive force, used racial epithets against the people who were at the party. And all this was reported.
The family involved wound up filing a lawsuit against the KCKPD, as KMBC News described.
It's the result of a police raid on a party 2 years ago, one in which police allegedly beat and maced children as young as 13 years old and used racial slurs.
The 28-page lawsuit says what happened next was chaos. Teenagers being struck by officers using pepper spray. Some teens had to be treated at a local hospital.
And DOJ came in and mandated two things that I'm aware of. One was yearly racial bias training for all law enforcement in Wyandotte County. And the second thing was this creation of this Law Enforcement Advisory Board, which was to advise law enforcement about what's going on in the community and how to best serve, and also to advise on policy.
Mm-hmm. Advise meaning no mandate.
No mandate.
Right.
No real power.
Okay.
So when Mayor Garner was elected, our first African-American mayor, former policeman, I supported him. Shortly after he was elected, everybody has an appointment. All the commissioners and the mayor have an appointment to the Law Enforcement Advisory Board. And he asked me if I would serve on the Law Enforcement Advisory Board, not sharing that I was going to be the chair of that board in my first experience of it. But I learned that at the first meeting.
Rick quickly realized that the group wasn't exactly doing its job.
So there were to be biannual reports submitted from the Law Enforcement Advisory Board, starting with its inception, I believe, in 2006. I came on, and as the chair, I started trying to find out more about the history and what's happened, what hasn't happened, and I wanted to see, these reports, these biannual reports. They didn't exist. Nobody had made any reports in 16 years of its existence that were required by the ordinance that created it. There was no advising going on that I could see at all. And so we started trying to come up with a way in which the community's voice could be heard And I started a team on the board of people who were planning these community engagement outings where we could sit down and people have a chance to talk. Of course, that was the beginning of the end for me as the chair of the advisory board. We brought back all of the plans for these listening sessions to the board, and the chief and the sheriff were both at the meeting where the board decided to go ahead with these listening sessions and said absolutely nothing.
So when you kind of were changing the process of things, how was the response from the other people on the board?
Well, there were several people on the board who were very much into it, really wanted this to happen. But it was probably about anywhere from a third to half of the board was in favor of these things happening, and the rest had been on the board for so long that they were used to the way it was, and they weren't interested in really hearing from the community in the way that we were planning to hear from the community. But the majority of folks were on board with it. Even folks who I doubted would be on board with it were like, this needs to happen. We need to hear from the community. We haven't done this before, and we need to hear. Yeah. And then it was early February that the mayor sent me an email telling me my services were no longer needed with the Law Enforcement Advisory Board. So.
And how did you interpret that?
I interpreted it that the police, the chief and the sheriff had basically said they wouldn't work with me. That's what my interpretation was. Yeah.
What you're saying is essentially that the mayor has less power than maybe some may think in the city, and that it seems like law enforcement is driving a lot of the decision making. Is that how you perceive this?
Yeah, very much so. The mayor made a promise in his campaign that he, if elected, he himself would go to D.C. to talk to DOJ about doing a pattern and practice investigation.
A pattern and practice investigation is when the Department of Justice looks at a police department as a whole, not one person or one situation, but the culture and policies and practices of the department.
And that was a campaign promise he made. And then afterwards, he didn't do it. And then when we tried to press him to, he said he wouldn't do it. So I think it's not much of a secret that a lot of the power in this community resides in not just the police union, but also the fire union. So I do believe that the mayor probably was responding to some pressure from the police union, knowing that they carry a lot of weight politically in our community.
So you were removed from the board, but do you feel like you were able to make an impact? Do you feel like you were able to achieve something in that role?
That's hard to say. I don't know. I know that I haven't seen anything from it since, and a couple of other allied folks who were on the board when I left, a couple of them have left. A couple of them are still on, trying to do the right thing.
By this point, even people outside of KCK were beginning to learn about Roger Golubski and those who had enabled him, like the people at Roc Nation and members of a group now known as the United Justice Coalition. Dania Diaz, Roc Nation's managing director of Team Roc, remembers when she first heard what was happening there.
It was during one of our United Justice Coalition meetings. So it's a group that we convened, incredible people who care about reforms in our legal system. And Barry Scheck is a member, one of the co-founders of the Innocence Project. And he started talking about what was happening in Kansas. And really, it was just so horrifying to hear. The first case that he brought up was really about Lamont McIntyre and how he had been wrongfully imprisoned for nearly 23 years. And it really kind of was a result of corruption that was deeply embedded in Kansas City, Kansas PD, and largely led by Roger Golubski. And so we immediately wanted to get involved and wanted to help.
What was it about this story that really felt particularly shocking or disturbing to you?
It's a microcosm of a larger issue, a larger system-wide issue that we see kind of play out throughout the country and in a lot of places in the world. And it's about abuse, it's about corruption, and it's about preying on vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals. In this case, it's Black women largely, and the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. And I think what really struck us, too, was the fact that it had been decades long. But this is exactly why we wanted to get involved, because we know that we had to bring light to the situation. And it's our responsibility to do so. And when women, in this particular instance, and children and families and generations have been impacted by violence and corruption and abuse, it's something that I think really pulls at our sense of responsibility. It pulls at our sense of humanity. And we want to live in a world where we respect humanity, where we respect people's ability to live a life that is thriving and that's productive. And when that's taken away, we all lose out.
Team Roc has partnered with local organizing groups, filed lawsuits, helped with press strategy, provided support to the survivors, and contributed many resources to the broader movement of people who want to see KCKPD change. But they, too, have run into the constant barriers erected by not only the police department, but the entire local government. They spent a lot of time, years, trying to just obtain information, filing information requests to get basic details on how the department works, including things like disciplinary histories and policy changes, and other information that I would argue is the right of civilians to have access to.
And basically, we were just asking for records related to, allegations of corruption, rape, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, reports concerning certain police officers and detectives, nearly 30 of them who were related to Golubsky, reports related to Golubsky as well, just like deaths in police custody, for a 10-year period. Oh, goodness. We had about 16 requests, and they denied 11 of them. And this is also after repeated extensions, right? Denied 11. They provided I think it was 2 to be exact, but there were policy manuals or things that you could find online. And then another 2 were under review. Yeah, that was their response. And this is after over a year of waiting for them to show good faith. And that didn't happen.
Even when the local government was willing to provide information, they often tried to make it prohibitively expensive.
They asked for over $2,200 in fees, et cetera, to produce documents. I think the average person without the resources of Roc would be just, give up. But we're not going to give up. And back in 2022, the district attorney, was Mark Dupree, said that they had received a $1.7 million sort of commitment to digitize records. And we don't really have an update on that, right? These are taxpayer funds that were allocated for this purpose, and there's been no update on that. And so again, when we talk about transparency and accountability and engendering trust and building trust, where's the update? It's been over 2 years. Why has it taken so long? And if there are valid reasons, why doesn't the community know about it?
The refusal to provide details about how the department has operated makes their promises of change ring a little hollow.
It's sad because you hear these statements about we're willing to work with the community, we're willing to, comply with any investigations, or this is something of the past. And I'm paraphrasing things that we've heard from police chief, mayor, et cetera. And you want to have faith that they will follow through with what we considered our obligations under CORA. And what we've received were these repeated boilerplate objections. And it's not just us. I think when we speak to other organizations on the ground, it's the same thing. It's the stonewalling, it's the running the clock, it's charging fees.
Like Dania said, officials in Kansas City have long promised real transparency. But when it comes down to it, they're not exactly committed. And that includes the mayor, Tyrone Garner, who is a former KCKPD officer. Among other roles, he was an internal affairs investigator and rose to become deputy police chief. During a mayoral debate in 2021, recorded by local news station Fox 4, Garner bristled at the idea that he allowed misconduct to occur, claiming that he was entirely in the dark about what was going on at the department.
I didn't sit on any information because I didn't know about any information. I knew it and found out just like you did.
Like Rick mentioned, as a candidate, Garner supported a DOJ investigation into the department, claiming they needed, quote, outside eyes to address the issues. And Mayor Garner showed support for an outside investigation again once in office. Here he is during a press conference in 2022.
This was done to fulfill my consistent commitment, again, to support, encourage, and welcome any independent outside investigations from authorities into any allegations of criminal misconduct by unified government employees, both past or present, and to reinforce my position that action should be taken.
Still, while he has said he welcomes investigations, he has stopped short of launching one himself. And many feel the mayor has not ensured the transparency and accountability that he promised. Perhaps the most effective strategy would be having the federal government get involved. Team Roc and others have also called for the DOJ to open that pattern and practice investigation. But so far, it hasn't happened.
I will always have hope. I always like to think that things are, in fact, possible. And so, yes, that's the short answer. I think if you look back, the DOJ indicted Roger Golubski twice, right? Some people will say it's long overdue, but finally we got some movement there. So that's encouraging. So I do believe that it's possible. And, sometimes things don't happen overnight, but it doesn't mean that they won't happen at all.
So now that Golubski is deceased, I think some people who are just hearing generally about this story and aren't in Kansas City may think, okay, well, that was it. That was our chance at accountability.
Golubski is the symbol of a deeper situation and a deeper problem in KCK. With regard to Golubski, he's a man who's done tremendous harm. He's been alleged to have committed heinous crimes, and those who worked with him, part of that as well. And you have to understand that there are a lot of people who are incarcerated that probably should not be. Like, the example of Lamont McIntyre. That was under Golubski's reign. So these are people whose cases need to be reviewed again. They need to be investigated. All of Golubski, every case that Golubski touched needs to be reviewed and investigated because there are people who are serving time for crimes they did not commit. So that's on the Golubski front. And certainly for all the women who were harmed and the generations of women and families that have been impacted, they deserve justice. They deserve, for their stories to be told if they want to share them. They deserve some legal remedy, whatever that looks like for them, that makes the most sense. How do we get to a place where there isn't another Golubski that's creating harm, that's causing harm, or any future, right? And so that begins with transparency, and so we can get to accountability. And from 1990s, right, the FBI did the investigation and said, the situation is grave here. And if it's not addressed, it's only going to get worse. And we saw it get worse. So we don't want that to happen again because there is a deeper problem that needs to be addressed. And if it stays in Kansas alone, the likelihood of that being addressed in a profound way, in a way that creates future change and no harm or less harm, it diminishes.
Rick Behrens also struggled with what Golubski's death means for the survivors, for the community.
There was a real deflated sense that I had of the ability to hold anybody accountable in this community. Yeah, there's just we've had a couple of meetings since with a lot of the women who Golubski abused, and I've been very impressed and moved by the way in which they're not quitting. They're determined that the story gets out regardless, and that there be some accountability. I have no idea what that could possibly look like at this point when the system has basically let it go. So yeah, anger mostly, but along with that anger, frustration, and a real kind of sense that all those forces that have held this community in check for so long are still in power, and it's going to continue to be a slog in which people's lives and livelihoods and families could be in jeopardy the more we push against this machine.
All through making this show, I've been wary of putting too much hope into the trial. Because even if the trial had gone ahead, even if Roger Golubski had been convicted of the civil rights violations he was charged with, I don't know that prison time would feel like justice. It wouldn't give back the years stolen from men wrongly convicted or women sexually assaulted. For people of faith, though, they believe in another kind of judgment. And Roger Golubski was, by his own account, a man of faith. He attended a seminary high school. He considered becoming a priest. Rick Behrens is also a man of faith. So I asked him how he squared Golubski's professed belief in God with his alleged actions.
Well, I don't know anything about his faith. I can't really comment on that. Other than to say that, one of the things the Bible tells us is that your faith is known by your works. And I suppose there's some forgiveness in the universe for him. I'm not there yet.
Many of the people in KCK aren't there yet either. That includes Davelyn Dobbs. 4 years ago, the Community Integrity Unit reviewed her son Donnell's case, a case connected to Roger Golubski.
My son, Donnell Dobbs, was convicted of a murder that he did not commit. He has done 16 years.
Reportedly, the unit thought he was innocent, and they were poised to recommend his release, until they were all fired. What happens now for her son, still in prison? That's next week, where we'll also dig into how the struggle in KCK connects to the rest of America.
I grew up in the same building as the Central Park Five. There is a traumatization that happens with policing in America that happens in Harlem, New York, the same way as it happened in KCK.
Next week on Corruption Uncovered. Corruption Uncovered is a podcast from Roc Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Roc. Team Roc partners with the Midwest Innocence Project to uncover corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. We want to extend a special thanks to the KCK community of survivors and advocates. Corruption Uncovered is produced by Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Josie Duffy Rice. This episode was written and produced by me and Kat Aaron, with additional production support from Justine Dom, Eric Mennel, and Yinka Rickford-Ingwin. Our editor is Joel Lovell, fact-checking by Will Tavlin, music licensing by Epidemic Sound. Our recording engineers are Pedro Alvira and Marina Pais, mixing by Davey Sumner. Kat Aaron and Jayan Berry are our executive producers. Thanks to Emerald O'Brien for production assistance this week. And thank you for listening.